So I've been asked to speak to you today about the unity and uniqueness of the human family. Now, my comments today are based upon several of my published works, the first of which is Racism, Not Race, which you've been told, and I'll repeat, is available at the back of the room. The second book, you'll have to wait until the fall. A Voice in the Wilderness, a pioneering biologist, explains how evolution can help us solve our biggest problems. Now, this book is partially autobiographical. It summarizes how I think about evolutionary biology. It also has a chapter on how I think about evolution and faith. Another paper that I wrote recently, which is really a discussion of popular culture, called God is Good, Chuck Not So Much, in the volume Supernatural and Philosophy. For those of you who are familiar with the longest running television show in horror fantasy genre in the history of American television, if you're not familiar with this show, I strongly recommend that you watch it. There have actually been 3 books on the philosophical issues raised by this television series. I've been in all 3 of them. I got the honor of writing the chapter on the war in heaven, which organizes the first 5 seasons. And finally, coming out also later in 2022, a book entitled Critical Approaches to Science and Religion. And I have a chapter in that book entitled Out of Africa, Where Faith, Race, and Science Collide. Now, that chapter was actually made possible by my good colleague, Dr. Charmaine Royal, who is sitting in the audience here, who was able to organize a major sociological study of American attitudes towards biological, genetic, and evolutionary concepts associated with human variation. And what we found in that study was one of the concepts that was most rejected by persons across the socially defined racial spectrum was the scientific fact that our species, anatomically modern humans, evolved in Africa. Now, as you have probably already guessed, that rejection of that scientific fact was deeply associated with socially defined race, with persons of European descent being most likely to reject that idea, but also significant percentages of African Americans rejected it as well. So now let's get to the heart of the matter. So my intellectual progenitor, J.B.S. Haldane, when asked God's view of creation, said the Creator would appear to have been endowed with a passion for stars, and on the other hand, for beetles. 300,000 species of beetles known, and perhaps more, as compared with somewhat less than 9,000 species of birds, and a little less than or over 10,000 species of mammals. Now, I argue to my students that, in fact, Haldane's view of nature isn't really correct, because what the Creator is really crazy for is microbes. There are at least 1 billion species of bacteria alone. The archaeans are all unicellular. Of the eukaryotic divisions, all but 3 of them are unicellular. So only animals, plants, and fungi are where we see multicellular organisms. So, now, we've talked about what makes our species, anatomically modern humans, unique. But most people are not aware of the fact that in the history of life on this planet, there were at least 8 bipedal intelligent hominid species, of which Homo sapiens sapiens was just one. Now, some people have argued that there was some special thing about Homo sapiens sapiens which allowed it to be the one which came out of the Pleistocene as the dominant hominid species on this planet. I beg to differ. We have absolutely no scientific evidence that Homo sapiens sapiens was in any way better than Homo neanderthalensis or better than the Denisovans. It simply happened to be the one that did. Now, many people who adhere to theistic evolution would say, well, that was because God planned for Homo sapiens sapiens to be the one. And in fact, I really enjoy one of the episodes of Supernatural with the angel Castiel is standing at the moment of the creation of the lineage which leads to humans, and he says to a brother angel, be careful, don't step on that one. Big plans for that. But again, I beg to differ. Now, we know that there are characteristics of anatomically modern humans, as Jeffrey pointed out, that are in fact unique. Our brain growth trajectory, our brain size, our descendant larynx, endocrine sweat glands. Did you know that we are the greatest endurance runners on this planet? In other words, no other mammal can run as far. And I'm sure you all know the joke about the 2 hikers who are in the Serengeti. One of them sees a lion in the brush, or a lioness in the brush, and he opens up his backpack and puts on his running shoes. And the other one says, you can't outrun the lion. He says, no, fool, all I have to do is outrun you. And if it were running long distances, no other animal can keep up with us. Now, another point about anatomically modern humans is our extended labor, which results from the very trade-off which made us anatomically modern humans, and that is the brain size and the head size of our offspring. And one of the consequences of extended labor was the creation in human societies of female bonded groups that helped their relatives or friends survive labor and the birth of their offspring. And so while we tend to be focused on the way human society is in the post-agricultural age, in which patriarchy was dominant, we have absolutely no evidence that patriarchy, and we have, in fact, a very good amount of theoretical justification to think that patriarchy really doesn't begin until the agricultural period, and that human societies were, in fact, organized around women and not so much men. Now, finally, lacrimation, emotional crying of our offspring, and T-cell function, which played a major role, of course, in our ability to survive numerous viral and other unicellular pathogens. And finally, the thumb, which gave us enhanced tool-making capacity. Now, I'm not going to give the long view of evolution with regard to humans, to save time, so that we can talk about things that are more to the point. Now, our closest living relatives are the chimpanzees. And in comparison to the chimpanzees, there are traits which humans have, which they don't have. And by the way, no one should be surprised by that, because by definition, species have unique traits. So we have delayed maturation, menopause, greater longevity, prolonged brain growth in humans, which then requires a higher percentage of body fat in the newborn to support brain growth, which, by the way, makes infants extremely vulnerable to malnutrition. And a few other points, because again, I'm trying to get us to the points that I want to make. Now, one of the things that I try to get across to folks is that despite the superficial appearances that we can see displayed in the human beings sitting in this room, we are all Africans. And what I mean by that is that any two people in the world share 99.9% of their genome in common. And you notice how I slipped and said Francis Collins was one of the people who gave us that scientific fact. Now, but did you know that if I took two Africans drawn at random, and an African and a European, the two Africans are more likely to be more genetically different from each other than the African and the European is. And that's because the vast majority of the genetic variability within our species can be found on the continent of Africa. Now, there has been migration of humans around the world, which began about 100,000 years ago. There has been some local adaptation and also random changes due to genetic drift. But in the most part, that's not a whole lot of variation, and it's certainly not enough to unambiguously partition humans into biological groups that we could call races. So, just to make a simple point, if we ask, how many genes are responsible for skin color? Most people know about 5 major genes, and then 15 subsidiary genes. But there's 19,000 coding genes, at least, in the human genome. So skin color is a minor portion of the genome that differentiates that particular phenotype. The brain, on the other hand, uses 82% of the human genome. So there's a huge difference. So we've been classifying people into groups based upon social, cultural criteria, not biological criteria. And that's one of the big messages of racism, not race. Now, I also want to make the point that in the current world, populations of European descent hold a great amount of social, political, and economic power. But their phenotype, that is light skin, is something that evolved very recently. So in this study, ancient DNA study, they're able to show that an 8,000-year-old individual whose grave was found in northern Spain actually had the genotype of an individual or an ancestral gene which was associated with dark pigmentation, not light pigmentation. Other traits, such as the blonde hair allele, may be as young as 6,000 years old in Northern Europeans, and it's probably about 12,000 years old in Melanesians, who, by the way, have dark skin. And so the idea that blonde hair and fair skin have to be associated with each other is, in fact, wrong. Now, I want to close on a few points. So this is the world of the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. These were the people that they knew, and these are the people who are mentioned in those texts. They don't mention the Shoshone or the Sioux or the Seminoles. They didn't know that those people existed. They didn't mention the Chinese. Now, In the 1st century CE, which is the time period of the writing of the New Testament, the Roman Empire had expanded much of the known world for people in the Levant. And so people now had a much broader sense of who was present in the world. Now, I'm going to end with a couple of really controversial claims. So, does any of this matter to God? Most of you realize that if the KT impact didn't occur in the Yucatan, humans probably would never have evolved, period. Now again, people who view theistic evolution from the point of, God made sure that there was an asteroid that landed in the Yucatan at that time so that mammals could become more dominant across the globe and eventually hominids would evolve. Well, I argue that my God is the God of the entire universe, not just of one planet. And as such, many events have occurred on planets throughout the universe that didn't result in hominid-type organisms becoming the most intelligent organisms on that planet. And God is still their God. Intelligent cephalopods in Alpha Centauri know God in a different way than we do as Homo sapiens sapiens. But the simple fact of the matter is that what is unique with regard to our relationship to God is nothing that occurred in the physical world, but it's something that occurred in the spiritual world. And in that vein, I'm going to leave you with Eucharistic Prayer C from the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, where it says, "From the primal element you brought forth the human race and blessed us with memory, reason, and skill. You made us the rulers of creation, but we turned against you and betrayed your trust, and we turned against each other. Again and again, you called us to return. Through prophets and sages, you revealed your righteous law. And in the fullness of time, you sent your only Son, born of a woman, to fulfill your law, to open the way of freedom and peace." So what makes us unique is our spiritual relationship to God, nothing in our evolved bodies. Now, when we broke with God, our brokenness is shown by patriarchy, racism, anti-lesbian, gay, trans, queer bigotry, war, capitalism. And I leave you with the words of the minister who most affected my own formation. And he said, "I have watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which makes a strange, unbiblical distinction between the body, the soul, the sacred, and the secular." Martin Luther King Jr. from the letter from Birmingham jail. I thank you for your attention.